Hi, everyone. My name is Raquel with FriendandMike.com, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us. The topic of today's webcast is what you need to know about securing Active Directory, sponsored by Semperis. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping details. There will be a Q&A session towards the end of today's presentation, so please type any questions that you may have in the Q&A box. Semperis has provided a couple of resources, which you can find on the right-hand side of your console, so please take a moment to check those out. And finally, this webcast is being recorded, so keep an eye out for a link in your email so you can rewatch the presentation or share it with a colleague. And now I'd like to introduce you to our two speakers. Today we have the pleasure of hearing from Guido Grillenmeier, Chief Technologist at Semperis, as well as Jim Doggett, CISO at Semperis as well. So we are in for a great event, and with that, I'll pass time over to Jim to take it away.
Very good. Well, first of all, I'd like to welcome everybody. We've got a good crowd today, it sounds like. I'm looking at the list of people online, and it's just a pleasure today to work with Guido today to present on a topic that I'm very, very passionate about. By background, I've spent the majority of my career at EY and then went on to be the Chief Technology Risk Officer for a division of JP Morgan, then on to the Chief Technology Risk Officer at Kaiser Permanente, and then also at AIG. So I've had a good bit of CISO level experience, and that's my goal today, is to add the broader perspective to Guido's detailed perspective today, and hopefully it turns out to be a great interaction between us and with you all. Guido?
Absolutely, it will. Thanks, Jim. And it's my pleasure to do this webcast with you and for our audience that is coming from all over the place. Welcome, everybody, wherever you may be. Good morning, good evening, good day. My name, Guido Grillenmeier. You can tell by the pronunciation and actually that long last name. I'm actually located in Europe, in Frankfurt, Germany, to be exact, and looking forward to a nice hour to discuss my favorite topic on Active Directory, how to best secure it, and I'm really excited to be here with you. My history has actually been with Hewlett-Packard for most of my career. I don't even want to name the number of years that I've been with HP, but it's been a very, very exciting time to consult a lot of companies on Active Directory topics, securing them, migrating them, and of course going through all sorts of let's say challenges also regarding managing, planning the restoration of Active Directory disasters, planning to actually avoid that, etc. And we'll share a little bit of that experience here today. And before we actually go into details of our topics, we'd like to get some feedback from your understanding. I'm starting a poll right now that you can now choose and basically select your favorite answer to on the last time that you actually tested your own disaster recovery processes in your environment. Because my understanding is, Jim, not sure if it's different for you, that many customers actually, or companies don't do this often enough. Yeah, that's what we've been hearing in the past many months that I've actually now been with Semperis. And what's your experience on that?
Yeah, it's been interesting. And back in my CISO days at those three places that I mentioned, Active Directory was actually never even one of my top topics, and I covered business continuity planning as well for two of the three of those. So I found it amazing that later on in my career, you start to discover there was a risk there that I really hadn't paid much attention to. Yeah, certainly.
Excellent. And we were getting some interesting answers here too. I'm going to go to the next slide that should show those answers for everyone to have a quick look. Won't need to comment on this, but it's the clear winner here that there is a plan, but it has never necessarily been tested. And I'm sure that is specifically the case for production, but hopefully at least some more experience available in the test environment, which doesn't always translate to production. But let's switch to that next poll on understanding, on everybody's understanding of the actual dependency of Active Directory in their environment. Are people aware of this? of how Active Directory is actually integrated with their applications and their business processes?
I think it's a great question. The next slide that when we start talking about this, I'm going to cover a little of this as well. But I was probably, in my CISO days, I was probably a bit ignorant of this space.
Because basically other topics were higher on your agenda. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It was just, it just never came up, and it wasn't the source of most of the hacks that were happening at that time. And the world has changed a bit since then.
I would have to agree on that. I think what people are realizing, and if not in this call, in this webinar, we'll certainly clarify that part, that the risk matrix has changed. Yeah, basically the capabilities of intruders has changed in how they actually go after Active Directory and whatnot. But we've got a good number of answers. Let me show that on the next screen. That basically shows that for the majority of our attendees, it basically is the main identity store for their work. And with that, Jim, I'll hand it off to you on our, let's say, first talking point.
Yeah, that sounds good. And again, before we get into Active Directory, I thought it might make sense to talk about, well, why are we even talking about Active Directory today? And I think part of it you just answered. By the vast majority of you, it is your primary store for identities that is out there. But I think it's even a little greater than that. And I sort of look at, since I've had a relatively long history of being a CISO, the requirements of my job, at least, have changed a whole lot over the years. It started out probably, and I'll call it the good old days, or 10, 20 years ago, where I got to determine what projects I wanted to take on, then I would do those projects, and I'd go to the board and I would tell about all the great things we had done. Today's time, that doesn't work quite as well, because all of a sudden the boards have gotten attuned to there is real risk there. There's real risk to their business there. And there seems to be now a great expectation that the CISO is managing the risk of security, which requires a couple of things that I'm not sure, at least I didn't used to think about it nearly as much. And that is, number one is I have to be a risk manager too. If you can't determine what the likelihood, probability, and what the impact of an event or something happening is to the business, it's very difficult to decide what to do in what order and to be accountable to the board and senior management. And I think it's sort of interesting, too, that the business now is also really wants to understand, really from a return on investment, what are they getting for it? So all in all, you really have to be three things. You do need to be a security officer and understand security. You've got to understand risk management. And lastly, you really got to understand the business, too, which is something a lot of people don't think about. If you don't understand how the business operates and what's most important to it, it's very difficult to secure it. Now let's transition that into how do we need to talk about Active Directory today? I think you guys answered it in the poll right before this pretty doggone well, saying that certainly in my past it's been that way, is almost all critical applications that I've worked with that are critical to the business continuing. They're major key applications, be it in a trading system or be it a healthcare hospital record maintenance system, they depend on Active Directory as their identity source. So from a importance to the business, in other words, the impact of Active Directory is not available becomes even more important. And usually there's a second part of that. What's the likelihood it's going to be attacked? For that, and we'll give you a lot of examples today, but it seems like almost every major breach that happens involves Active Directory in some way, shape, or form. Bad guys like to go there. The bad actors understand that if they can get into Active Directory, escalate privileges, they can do a whole lot of damage. And I haven't even talked yet about denial of access and all of that kind of stuff.
Right.
The last thing that I think is really important on this one is that we talk in terms of how hard it is to recover. And again, all these topics we'll go into a little more detail, so you'll get a more technical view, if you will, of why it's so important. With that, let me turn it over to Guido and let you start delving into Active Directory specifically.
Absolutely. What I'll say to the end of this is basically that companies and let's say the board will be asking the folks responsible for any service, that could be Active Directory, could be other services in the business, because they're becoming more and more aware of malware taking down whole businesses. It's all over the news. We'll have some examples in a second, but the point is people need to understand how fast can we recover. So that last point is very important. It's not just a topic of understanding the dependency, which we're now showing basically in a little bit of a graphic there, that Active Directory, we all know that it is heavily utilized and integrated into your on-prem applications. But of course, everybody is trying to get away from on-prem, from their own data center, moving to the cloud. It sounds much more attractive running, let's say, on modern infrastructure, modern services, etc. But I have to say that a lot of companies continue even their cloud services with a strong dependency on Active Directory back again. And that, for example, is when they use federation services to actually authenticate against cloud services. So where the on-prem AD is the system that hands out a SAML token, as an example, to then authenticate against those cloud applications, be it Salesforce, be it Office 365, be it whatever type of application that companies might be hosting in the cloud. And if in that situation you do have an on-prem or even a malware attack on Active Directory that you might actually be hosting on domain controllers running with infrastructure as a service in the cloud, that doesn't, just because they're hosted elsewhere, doesn't take the risk of Active Directory being attacked away, because Active Directory itself is basically fairly open to a variety of attacks. We're going to talk about a few of those. But we wanted to make clear with this slide is that AD is, if that isn't secure, a lot of the rest of the dependent systems are also not. That's also how you see it, isn't it, Jim?
Yeah, it's sort of interesting. I always heard the saying that, we're moving to the cloud, so we don't need to worry about this. And what I've learned in my first month here at Semperis is that that's just not the case, because most people still use Active Directory regardless of what other cloud applications they happen to be using now. And that may go away someday, but we'll talk a little bit more about that later.
Exactly. And let's give some examples on those fairly recent attacks that are well known. There's plenty. We just need to search the web every day. We're warned of new attacks. I like to highlight one that's not even on this slide right now that none of us had foreseen in the March timeframe. Actually, right at the beginning of March, the Hafnium attack against Exchange servers. Basically, 4 new zero-day vulnerabilities were basically publicized by Microsoft, of course, along with a patch, but people couldn't even patch as quickly as those internet-facing Exchange servers were attacked by hackers. And then we realize, Exchange is pretty darn close to my Active Directory. Active Directory is the next stepping stone for those intruders to go after, to then spread inside your infrastructure, to first understand it. What else is there? Where are those, let's say, privileged accounts? Where is data stored that is important for the company, be it on specific file servers that are well protected or whatnot? How do I get to that data, databases, etc.? It is driven through Active Directory. There's plenty of examples on this slide. I'll add a quick word on SolarWinds that a lot of the folks that are listening right now probably are thinking more, wait a second, wasn't this an attack in the cloud? Wasn't this an attack in Azure against Office 365 before then basically getting back into the SolarWinds system and attacking that code before it spread, etc.? Well, that originating attack, that was actually on an ADFS system that was breached through the service account of the ADFS server being hacked in Active Directory to then get to the key, to that golden ticket, to that golden SAML ticket that allowed the attackers to create SAML tickets to get to cloud resources without actually needing to authenticate against that on-prem AD. That is one of those examples where the actual attack started in a breached Active Directory, but then spread towards the cloud. So those are a number of attacks that work that way.
Yep.
Did you want to add to that, Jim?
No, I think we're good on that. Let's move on to the next slide.
Exactly. The next one is actually an interesting one that I wanted to add to give people an understanding that this risk potential isn't going to change anytime soon. What we see here is a little bit of a timeline that I've created with Gil Kirkpatrick, my, let's say, master of disaster buddy, that we created, or we've written a guide on Active Directory disaster recovery back in 2005, sort of, 16 years ago now, on the basis of Windows Server 2003 SP1 back then. That was sort of a big change in those days on how Active Directory replication was improved and whatnot. So lots of Active Directory improvements in 2008 and 2008 R2, and further security improvements in 2012 R2, and then 2016, another important update with privileged access management. But then it stops. 2019 basically didn't have any other relevant updates in the code that would more secure Active Directory on-prem, because all the focus of Microsoft is, of course, going to Azure Active Directory. So that basically means since 5 years now, we haven't seen any security updates in Active Directory. That doesn't mean that known attack vectors wouldn't then be patched by Microsoft with further updates. Of course, and Microsoft is doing an excellent job on that and on getting those out quickly. But it's harder for folks to actually patch quickly enough. The zero logon attack that we're going to talk about in a few minutes again is such an example. Of course, there are those type of new attacks that you need to prepare for. Jim?
Yep. So Guido, there's an interesting question, though. From what looking at this is, it looks like that really Active Directory was never designed to be secure. It looks like it was an afterthought to add security to it afterwards. Is that?
Well, it's definitely. I don't totally agree with that statement, because I think Active Directory security has been much stronger than what it was, what it came from NT4 days. So there was a lot of logic added, but it's a different type of threat these days. Kerberos was considered to be a totally secure protocol for authentication, and in the meantime, hackers have learned to hack Kerberos. Hackers have learned to actually take the ticket granting ticket and use it elsewhere in the right setup of an environment. So it was clearly designed with security in mind, but the world has moved on. Hackers have moved on, and actually the tools that hackers are using, Mimikatz to name one of them, have become much smarter than what a hacker would have had 15 years ago. So clearly, I think the protection mechanisms, and that's probably sort of what you meant, the protection mechanisms that have been put in place back then, they're no longer protecting Active Directory good enough. And that's basically what we want to sort of make people aware of, that when you think about such a, let's say, security framework such as this NIST framework that helps you to understand that there is, of course, a phase to any attack, understanding those risks, protecting the service that you're looking at for vulnerabilities, understanding when you're being attacked, and then understanding how to respond to that. All of these phases typically are better handled with some tooling around that helps you, or scripting on your own that helps you to identify this. The logic of intruders doesn't change that much. It basically doesn't matter which framework you use. It's always identifying an opportunity because you didn't close the door. We're going to talk about a few doors that are wide open in AD. But if you close it, that's great. You're already better protected. But if you're not, then you actually have to learn how to respond to somebody in your network. And in worst case, understand how you get out of that again. And basically understand how to, that's that third part of the circle, how to recover quickly on that. I want to give a few examples here, Jim, to our audience of what they can do basically even before they are attacked, because there are tools out there. We also provide a free tool that I'll talk to in a second that allows people to understand what vulnerabilities they have in Active Directory. People don't realize, and this is also part of the design topic that Jim is hinting at, Active Directory was actually designed as an open directory that is accessible by everyone to read. Yeah, that's that classic authenticated user. We're going to have a look what that actually means. That has all sorts of permissions to read things in Active Directory. That doesn't mean that user can change anything in AD, but that he can use it to understand who can change AD, who can I attack to actually then get to higher privileges, how can I elevate my privileges, etc. And it's flabbergasting to see how much an authenticated user can see with the right tools at hand to identify vulnerabilities in your environment. That's the first thing that we will check.
Yeah, the interesting thing to me, and this is very similar in my mind to what everyone seems to focus on first in security, is the system vulnerabilities, your scanners, your app scans or your system scans. This is basically what we're talking about now is doing the same thing, but for Active Directory, which for whatever reason, it's just never been a focal point of mine until recently.
Right. But let's do understand that there are tools out there that have been out for a while that are also being used by red teams, but they're not necessarily tools that easily accessible by, let's say, the average administrator. Bloodhound, great tool, love it. It basically gives you information on, let's say, the shortest path to the keys to the kingdom. How do I plan an attack? Yeah, it could be used, of course, by intruders as well, but it is a little bit involved in what it requires for an installation. The point is, if you use these tools yourself, you, of course, can use that same information to then protect yourself. You'll understand that, in this graphic, it's basically showing that there is a system that is potentially shared by a user that is, let's say, in the low part of your food chain. With that I mean permission set. It might be a help desk administrator that is not administrating AD, but he's sharing a system with some other users where your domain admins also log on to. And so once you've compromised that help desk admin, which is an easy task on your end devices to do, that's where typically the attacks, of course, begin. Yeah, you can then easily elevate your privileges, and Bloodhound is one of such tools that help you understand that risk. Ping Castle is another great command line tool to allow you to evaluate the security posture, and a tool that we're giving you, actually we've announced that in March, we've brought it to the market in March, is Purple Knight. Purple Knight is a very easily tool for easy handling of scans in your Active Directory. And I'm going to try to find that screen share button here again. And here it pops up. And now I can click share to actually give you a very quick demo of the tool without talking too much about it, because, of course, we're a little bit limited in time. What you see on the screen is basically a simple domain environment with my child domain, and it's a multi-domain force, a root domain and a child domain, and I've got some users in there. Of course, a classic environment. I'm not going to spend much time on this, but I am currently going to use a very simple user that I've deliberately called just a child user, that literally is nothing but a member of the domain users group, and against the rest of the forest, like the root, it's just an authenticated user. I'm going to use that account to run Purple Knight. When you download that tool, you just unzip it basically, and you do not have any installations. And then I'm going to double click on this to actually run it, and it pops up with that scanner that now checks all of the scripts that make out the logic of our tool. They're all signed, so nobody can tamper with them. Our tool would basically block execution because we don't want to run scripts that that we don't trust. Yeah, and then basically you go through this tool, you select the forest that you want to scan. It immediately finds out all of the domains in your forest. In my case, of course, only 2, and then I can choose to scan that environment. I can even choose, and this is one of those tests that we have disabled by default. This is a very powerful test, the zero logon vulnerability test. That is that, let's say, fairly recent vulnerability that was made. People were made aware of that in the last year, that allows an intruder to easily change the password of a domain controller. Well, if you can easily change the password actually to all zeros, that's where the name comes from, zero logon, then you're in that environment within minutes, and for each of these things, we of course tell you the MITRE ATT&CK framework category of those different let's say, result sets, of those indicators of exposure that we give you. We're scanning in this revision some 64.
So what kind of privileges do I need to have to run this tool?
Actually, this is exactly why I showed that I'm using that lowest privileged account, because I am currently, and this is a good question, Jim, I'm looking at the Active Directory with the eyes of the intruder himself. As soon as an intruder grabs permissions in the environment, they will be able to run the same type of scripts, tools, and whatnot to have the same information that I now have, and I see in my, of course, let's say, environment that I've played around with a lot. I, of course, have a security posture, and believe me, it's not even as bad as some production environments that we've been able to scan for customers. We are able to see things like even the evidence of a Mimikatz DC shadow attack. If you do see that, be aware it's too late. You've already been compromised. That's, of course, not good. But we tell you which machine was attacked as an example. Each of these validations, each of these tests come with a good description of what are we actually testing, what's the likelihood, and what you should do to basically go and fix the environment. And let's look at that zero. Yeah.
We've got a question coming in that I think we probably ought to answer now. And it said someone made a comment saying Bloodhound is great, but it's usually blocked by our antivirus. Any comment?
Yeah. I mean, that's I would expect that most antivirus tools don't know our tool at this point. Yeah. Let's be clear. Any scanning tool is quickly on the risk list of antivirus tools. Yeah. So that is then something where you will need to set up some exemption to actually run tools like this. They are powerful tools to help you understand vulnerability of the environment. If you don't want those single tools, then of course you can run tools, let's say, more professionally with a system deployed to just perform that scanning and even do it in an automated way. But these free tools you would typically run on an existing system that could be blocked by AV. Really depends on the antivirus. Gotcha. But what I want to point out here is that this is something that we found in many environments where people thought that they had deployed the patch for zero logon, but they didn't reboot the machines yet. And then the RPC calls required for an attack, they're still there, and the system is still vulnerable. The last example that I want to give, because I think everybody has gotten the gist of how this tool works, it's really easy to use. You get a comprehensive report, and we also show you things that you might have totally overlooked. This is an example of another one that many customers, even Microsoft scans, are not typically looking at this if the owner of the domain controller's computer's account is maybe not a domain admin. And this has caused some raised eyes in some of our customers because they've seen this and go, oh my God, why is that? And this is because they've changed their provisioning mechanisms so that the domain admins, they don't need to do everything. They've ordered a normal server and then just done the DC promo. And at that time, this system has already been part of the domain. And everybody should know, if you own an object in AD, for example, the domain controller computer object, you basically can change the password of that system. You can grant yourself the permission to change the password of that system. And then again, you own your directory. So that's all I wanted to show on that tool. There's plenty that we can, plenty of more things that we could talk about. I'd recommend anybody to download those type of free tools and basically be using them, periodically to understand your vulnerability, because that is where it all starts. You have to understand the vulnerabilities so that you can then take that next step to also understand, how do I protect myself from those threats. And this is sort of the next phase that we would now be discussing. What if the intruder's gotten in, or I have a rogue admin? That's obviously always the possibility. How do I understand what was changed in my Active Directory? And this is where we want to give you the warning that don't rely on your Active Directory audit events as your only information of source for changes in your environment. This Mimikatz DC shadow attack that you've seen triggered with my Purple Knight scan is just an example. That's typically too late. You will already have had an intruder in your environment that has compromised the domain admin account, but now wants to sort of move laterally in Active Directory and hide his tracks with actually adding another account and not continuing to use that compromised domain admin account. And that is where DC Shadow comes in, because you do need to have domain admin credentials already, but then they can register any other system that they have already taken control of, run Mimikatz in a particular way that it behaves like a domain controller, and literally pushing out changes at the replication streams that then, of course, replicate to all other domain controllers. That could include group membership changes, adding SID history of a sensitive group to another, let's say, unprivileged account, and using that to then gain access elsewhere, actually move across trusts to other domains in your forest, or even other trusted forests, etc. So that is something that these type of attacks allow without you seeing them in the audit event logs. There's other examples. I've mentioned zero logon already. You typically don't monitor for password changes anywhere, like your domain controllers, or group policy changes. It's difficult to understand, or even if you've not set up auditing correctly. I'm adding a link to let you guys know that there are, there's more information out there to read. And I'm giving you some examples here without reading it all, to understand there are tools out there that help you to analyze, even after the change has occurred, what has changed in Active Directory. Pretty cool tool, the AD timeline tool, to analyze the metadata of your Active Directory to help you what has actually changed in a particular time frame. Of course, you can use your own scripting capabilities to sort of help you understand changes on your most critical groups. That's recommended anyways if you don't have other monitoring tools that do that for you. It's not so difficult to run a task to perform every now and then a check against, let's say, a baseline that you define for your most privileged groups or other settings. Think of ACLs, think of changes to the admin SD holder object, to the root of the domain. All of this can be scripted. Or, of course, you can use professional monitoring tools that read Active Directory changes, ideally directly from the replication stream, and then allows you to actually see those changes in a searchable format. It's extremely powerful to understand, let's say, in a really easy manner what has changed in Active Directory, and allow you to also undo it.
Yeah.
And with that, we're actually coming to that last third of our circle here, of our attack circle. And before we delve into those details, we do have another poll to ask you for concerns that you have around AD recovery after cyber attack. We'll delve a little bit more into this topic. But Jim, I understand you didn't really have a concern in a long time in the role as a CISO in other companies, right? It wasn't really on your mind, is that right?
Well, again, and I think it was before a lot of these ransomware, and it got highlighted a bit more. Interesting, though, the risk was even there still for people to break into it and escalate privileges. So it's certainly an area I think I should have probably paid a lot more attention to, The only time I really did is when we did a major update where we tried to have standard configuration of all of our domain controllers around the world.
Yeah.
We did that. We learned a very hard lesson about how difficult it was to take a copy of one offline, simplify it, change the configuration, change some of the rules that are in there, and then all the testing we had to do to get it back in to ensure that it didn't break applications. And this ended up being, across our whole environment, almost an 8-month exercise.
Yeah, and you will have learned in that exercise that especially in a multi-domain forest, and that is what we see being used in many enterprise environments for sure, but even in medium-sized companies, you don't just have a single domain. You actually have a multi-domain forest like of course, at a different scale than the one I've showed in my demo. But as soon as you have multiple domains involved in your environment, it gets even harder to recover Active Directory quickly. And if I show you the results of our poll here, that's actually perfectly reflected that people fear that it is hard to recover Active Directory quickly once you have the need to do so. That's not to say that it's not easy to recover a single domain controller quickly. Yeah, so that's not the worry that most people have, and I think they've really understood it here from the question. It's when the service goes down, when all of your AD goes down, that is when it becomes hard. And we're going to talk a little bit about why is that a real risk these days. We've given some examples at the beginning of our talk here. And the thing is that if you look at the lowest line here of impact with the unauthorized personnel that has physical access, potentially a rogue admin or a natural disaster, schema failure, the probability of those have always been fairly low. People might judge it differently for different environments. But either you've had a high probability, an admin error, or literally a domain controller failure in the past that you could then work on because it didn't really have a big impact. The world has moved on and malware has taken over. Ransomware is basically just the next step of malware spreading in your environment. And then we should actually call it probably, I'm sure they're named cryptoware or whatever it's called, but that ransomware is, of course, where attackers have been successfully intruding the environment, gaining elevated privileges through the vulnerabilities that exist in AD and in other systems, spreading the malware that would then fully encrypt all systems. And this is a reality, likely the highest risk to Active Directory environments these days, that you have to be able to recover from such a ransomware attack quickly. Ideally, of course, without your backups having the malware in them, but we'll get to that in a second. I want to make sure that people understand what they don't want to see when they log on in the morning to some system, or actually see this pop up on their workstation, servers, whatever. This is the type of message that you would see at a malware attack, except for, Jim, remind me of what number is it? It's not $300 that intruders, criminals are asking for these days, right? And Bitcoin to pay for that key to unencrypt data. Is that right?
Yeah, I think it's gone up into the hundreds of thousands now. And again, it feels like an Austin Powers movie moment. Where
It does.
He was a little out of time with what's there. But the bad guys are getting smarter, but they're also attacking. They're finding it very fruitful to attack much larger companies that have no choice but to pay if they want it back.
Yeah. And of course, the sad truth is nobody should pay those ransoms. I mean, that's a clear fact. Yeah, nobody should pay that, because as long as people continue to pay it, this is funneling the ransomware gangs. In the end, it's the business. Yeah, for them, it's a business. It's for others, it's a job. The guys come in every day, during their work time, not in the evening, and then attack other time zones in the world with what they are good at. Yeah, they can download tools to help them with this. They don't need to be the cracks at actually attacking your environment. They rent that service. They can, it's literally pay as you go type of services to attack environments. It's mind-boggling the deeper you get into this, and you don't want to see the screen specifically not on your domain controllers. The problem is, and this is an fairly old, August 2020. So what is that? 10 months now, 9 months now ago, that we've done a similar poll like the one that we've done at the beginning of our session here. A lot of folks haven't actually tested their recovery, or don't even have a recovery process in place. Yeah, won't go into analyzing these numbers right now. The fact is, you must prepare. Yeah, that Microsoft white paper that we've highlighted at the bottom here, it's critical to be aware of that. It does do a good job of describing the steps that you need to take to recover AD. Do read it, do download it, do have it ready. But don't just let it sit in your drawer. When you are attacked and then need to recover, that's the last time, that's the worst time, I should have said, the worst time to actually read such a white paper and be able to recover. And that's sort of the story that Maersk ran into, that they weren't prepared to actually recover their AD from scratch. They've had a cyber attack, and again, it's just a big example of a company that has had such an attack. It's a good story from a storytelling perspective. It's certainly not great for Maersk, but they were very open with this because they wanted to warn others. They wanted to warn other companies, don't do the same mistakes as we have made. And so they've come out and explained all the challenges they've had, not only, of course, recovering AD, but they've made it clear that they couldn't recover anything else before they actually got their AD back. This story is very well described in, we've added the source from the Andy Greenberg, basically excerpt of his Sandworm book. I can also recommend that whole book. Totally good read on ransomware gangs today and the way that they work, the way that they behave. Yeah, it's really a good read from the excitement and what we learn from it. It's not a good story to understand the risk potential, but if you don't prepare, this is what happened to Maersk. At that time, Andy Powell was their CISO, and basically getting the message out there, guys, we weren't prepared. It took us 9 days. 9 days. Many businesses wouldn't survive because at that time, nothing worked. They didn't know what ship was in which harbor, where, what type of cargo was stored. They couldn't unload the ships because even that needed to go to particular trucks. Even the ports were closed because part of that access mechanism was controlled by Active Directory integrated systems, etc., etc. So it's really been a bad story for them. They've paid big time. They've made some numbers publicly available. Everybody knows that they for sure paid even more to keep the customers on board. But you'll want to learn from that you want to be prepared for a recovery. Did you want to add to that, Jim?
The biggest thing I just say is that as your business continuity team or disaster recovery teams contemplate tests, this I think is just one you absolutely need to do a trial run with, because I don't think anyone can appreciate the difficulty of recovering until you've actually been through it.
Exactly. And so to prepare for it, let's not forget our session focus is AD security. The problem is that if you cannot secure AD good enough to prevent an attack from happening, then actually getting it back from a backup is part of your security plan, because AD makes out a lot of your business security, the underlying infrastructure for your business security. So you want to make sure, first of all, that you do have backups. And I'm pretty sure anybody on this call will have backups of their Active Directory. So That's some level of preparation. Sadly, your standard Windows Server backup would also back up your operating system. Even if you take a system state backup only, you take up a lot of not only disk space, but also basically data that malware will most likely have already resided in for quite some time before it becomes active, if you don't recognize this one way or another. But you'll also want to understand that how is it if I need to recover? Once you have malware, your machines will be dead, and the fastest way to recover is often spinning up new machines, often or usually virtual, in your own environment or in the cloud. That's definitely an option that many customers are looking at, to spin up new domain controllers very quickly, be it on Azure, be it on AWS. They spin up new machines in minutes, just plain operating system, and then it's up to you to get your backups into those environments and recover your Active Directory quickly to then spin up other domain controllers from that. So that is actually a good path forward that you'll also want to look at. And ideally, you're not going to do that. I think it's 28 steps in that Microsoft guideline. Those steps are not trivial. They are complicated. They are prone to human error if you actually run through them. And it's not the time to actually run into more errors during the recovery. So you want to automate a lot of that. Can be done, again, if you've got great scripting folks. And I've seen some very cool solutions, let's say homegrown solutions, that would help you to recover AD more quickly. But if the guy that has programmed that is gone, then of course, other problems start. So what we want to pass on to you, do ensure that you have something in place. Of course, you can do it yourself. Of course, some other tooling, also tools that we provide, will help you to just do it more quickly and be faster. But there's another thing that we want to give to you before we open it up for more Q&A. And that is basically, don't ignore the basics. This security framework is really good to understand how an attack works. Ideally, you don't allow it to get that far in your environment. And if you basically use even just the most basic security best practices, you are already increasing your security and decreasing your attack surface in Active Directory. That starts with something like reducing the attack surface by running the majority, sometimes all of your domain controllers with server core. Certainly the ones that are outside of your data center, but ideally all of your domain controllers. It's often done to keep a few of them with, let's say, the full version, because it's sometimes easier to actually manage that, especially around group policy, things like that. But the majority of your domain controllers should run as server core. I would actually add that any domain controller outside of your data center should be read-only domain controllers, but it seems like I've lost that war on trying to convince customers to use that, because I do not see read-only domain controllers used heavily in the industry. But the next thing, just as strong, is segmentation of duties. And this would, of course, entail that your own administrators do not work in Active Directory with their Office account, with the one that they do mail with the one that they click on links and whatnot. Have a separate AD account. This is standard, I shouldn't see this in any customer environments not being done. Right, Jim?
Absolutely. And again, you said it, these are the basics. But again,
Absolutely.
Out of the box, it may not be natural, especially if you're not a security-minded individual managing Active Directory, which in many cases you're not.
Yeah, and sometimes it's sort of a team's responsibility that actually even the AD team assumes that the security team is taking care of everything. They may not be in the same organization in large companies. I do have to say I've worked with a lot of companies that had extremely smart Active Directory administrators that took AD security totally serious, and that's how it should be. Yeah, you don't treat AD as a second-class system. It is a first-class system. That is why you also should ideally configure it in a tiered manner. Microsoft has sort of, let's say, caused some confusion last year, at the end of last year, when they let's say, denounced the enhanced security admin environment, the ESAE tiering architecture that they've for quite a few years have promoted. Yeah, they're now no longer promoting it. That doesn't mean that folks that have implemented it, that have a separate forest, a red forest, a bastion forest, you name it as you want, to protect your production forest, that's not a good idea. It still is, especially if you have it deployed. But they're now, of course, looking at how can we combine this with cloud integration and basically use Azure AD to help you protect your on-prem AD, etc. So that's another thing that you can, of course, look at, and I've added the link at the bottom of this page. In general, the main statement that we can pass on to you is don't forget the basics. Keep to them, stick to them, and use it to also protect AD, not just all the other business servers, because those other servers may very well depend on your Active Directory. Right. And with that, we have one more poll that we'd sort of like to get your feedback on, and then we can already open it up for Q&A. I'll also now open that Q&A window on my side to understand what other questions come, but please do submit your answers to the poll questions that you hopefully see on your screen, and can then let us know how you basically weigh the risk of AD and how it poses that in your environment.
Yeah, and I think while they're answering this, one other point that I always like to point out, because this is another one of my pet peeves in security, is that it's great that you do an assessment at one time of your AD or any other area. The real key is it going to stay fixed if you identify weaknesses and fix it? So the real key to me is continuous control over this. Active Directory, just because it's fixed today, it tends to be a very active, if you will, area of change, and you've got to be careful.
Absolutely, and that's a good point, because scanning with tools, even our tool, is a good thing to do. I absolutely recommend even other scanners in the environment. But if you don't do it continuously, you don't know what might have changed the minute after you performed that last scan. So we're getting some good information back on this. I'll show this screen, the answers for a few seconds here. There is plenty of folks that will definitely follow up with their security team and would like to do an assessment. And again, do use the tools available to you, or let your teams know that those tools are available. And now we'll look at those other questions that might be in the queue. And then did you have a chance to have a look at some of this already? Jim, I'm looking at this
let's
now.
have a couple of them that let me read them out to you and see if you can give an answer to a couple of them. One person asked, what's the most common configuration setting mistake that people make that leaves them open to the cyber attacks? And I assume that's related to Active Directory.
That's actually a good one, because there's plenty. We only covered, a few examples that I've shown in the Purple Knight scan with leaving a vulnerability open that you could have patched. Yeah, but there's others that are more configuration error, and that includes allowing unconstrained delegation on computers, often servers that run applications that are configured in Active Directory to allow just that, an unconstrained delegation. What does that mean? It basically means that that machine is allowed to use any user's token, the TGT of the Kerberos token, and pass it on to impersonate that user on some other system. It's meant, think of a web application, a host that you have of a web application, to then impersonate the user, for example, against a database, to only read information that is relevant where that user has to have access to, and he's supposed to not read other data. It's a design, let's say, that's a little bit old school, But the point is, there's still quite a few applications building up on this. What's the risk? Well, you heard me say that you can impersonate any user. That also includes that if you know how, and be sure intruders do know how, they, first of all, are able to read what are these objects. As an authenticated user, you easily find out what are the systems in your forest that are configured with this unconstrained delegation, because AD, again, is allowing a lot of read permissions like I've shown you in my scan as a simple user. Then he knows what to go after. He finds a way to get to that system, and now the intruder invokes your domain controllers to actually authenticate against that system, and voila. And there's different ways to do that, of course. And once you have a TGT, either of course, a domain admin that happens to log on to that system, you've already got his TGT, and whoa, you've got the keys to the kingdom. But you can even invoke a domain controller. I'll just raise the flag on printer bug here, yeah, that if you have the printer service running on domain controllers, you can invoke an authentication of that domain controller back to the system that an intruder has now compromised, and voila, you've got the computer account TGT, and like we've discussed before with the zero logon attack, you now own the domain. As soon as you have the permissions as a domain controller, you don't only own the domain, you actually own the AD force. Wow. So that's an example. I have seen, and this is in a production environment just recently where we've helped a customer, that they have enabled inheritance on the admin SD holder object. Enabling inheritance on an object that's supposed to be a fixed security ACL list. That's what that admin SD holder object is. It's getting a bit technical here, but the point is it's an object in AD that gets stamped to all your most privileged accounts so that they are protected from when somebody makes a mistake in AD to inherit, let's say, the help desk group to reset all users' passwords. Yeah. That should not include your domain admins.
Absolutely.
If you've now enabled inheritance, you've opened up the door and basically turned off security on one of those core, let's say, capabilities in Active Directory to protect you. Okay.
Let's go on and do a couple more questions. One thing that I wanted to just mention to everyone is if anyone wants the free Purple Knight tool, the link is in the resource section up that you should have access to right now. And we are, as I think we've already answered, we're sending out the slides to this as well.
Exactly.
Another question that came up, though, is they're asking, it says, although all of this is very concerning, how much longer do I need to worry about AD being attacked? I thought everything was moving to the cloud, and this is one of the fallacies that I fell into for a while as well.
That's actually good, and I think the sad truth is that this is going to be more of a story for larger companies. Let's say a longer story. I compare Active Directory to the mainframe. Yeah, it'll be the last thing that you'll switch the light off in your on-prem environment, because you'll need to migrate all those applications that you've invested a ton of money in to actually integrate with Active Directory with your on-prem AD before you can get totally rid of that. Yeah, even if you've moved to the cloud, and again, lots of folks are using Office 365. It's, I would say, a very smart integration that Microsoft has done there with Azure AD and then Office 365. You synchronize your on-prem AD, and depending on how you configure it, you can even log on to those resources without needing your on-prem AD. Lots of companies don't configure it that way, but please do think about it so that if your on-prem AD is down, that at least you can reach your cloud resources. Again, if you're using Federation, that doesn't work that way. You still need your on-prem AD to actually get to the cloud resources. The point is, a lot of applications, business applications, are integrated to your on-prem AD, and until you haven't moved those, modernized those, and we all know application modernization is a multi-year thing. I'm easily thinking 5-10 years. I'll be, looking at retiring before AD has retired. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Cool. So that's the reality. We've
got a couple other that I think we can answer fairly quickly. One person is asking about what about PKI security? Taking this over allows allows to take over any identity-generated arbitrary authentication certificate and use certificate-based login. What do you think of that?
Absolute valid comment, and we could list many other risks there. There is ways to secure PKI sort of to at least be secure outside of your an AD dependency. There's ways to do that. But many folks don't deploy PKI that way. They have AD integrated PKI and even have that master key not well protected. But there are ways that we should probably make recordings from some of our HIP recordings, some of our HIP sessions available to people to understand that depending on how they integrate PKI with their Active Directory, it would be totally the risk that the person that has asked the question here would be in the environment, that all your certificates in PKI are just as much at risk if your AD is attacked. That, of course, also goes for other, strongly integrated systems. I'm thinking of DFS namespace. DFS is very commonly used to integrate with Active Directory to allow finding shares in a large environment with many file servers without the end user needing to know the file server names. It's DFS integrated. That doesn't work. Printing, there's plenty of things. I like that last question. I'm seeing one with moving to the hybrid cloud using Azure AD. Are there any big or main security topics to look at into doing this? Of course, Azure AD has its own set of challenges to do right, and we will also help customers to understand that with updated tools. What are the actual security risks with Azure AD? The key thing that I pass on to customers is don't hesitate to, for example, enable the password sync, the password hash sync from your on-prem AD to your Azure AD. Often customers hesitate to do that. That sounds like a risky process. Oh, it's the password of my users. I don't want them in the cloud. I'd rather use federation services. But it's actually services that Microsoft can provide to you that you otherwise don't get easily. It's a hash of the hash that would be synced to Azure. And then Microsoft can still check if those passwords of those users, because they, of course, can get back to the original hash of that, have been captured, have been compromised in the lovely darknet. Microsoft invests a ton of money to understand what has been compromised by intruders because they sell it in the darknet. Microsoft is, of course, with a special team buying these databases to understand what has been hacked. And then, of course, there's public information also available in what has been hacked. And they use this to warn you have a hacked account. And that information is really hard to get for your on-prem AD. So that hashing gets you that benefit.
So Guido, we're just about out of, or we are out of time, I should say. So I guess, and I know we've got some questions we haven't answered yet. Couple things, we've got the questions written and we will get back to you with answers to. And if you have more questions, you can reach out to either of us. We'll give you, I think you have contact information that is widely available. And then again, if you're interested at all in any of our tools at any point, if that becomes a need to cover the risks around almost everything we've talked about today, happy to chat with you on that as well. Guido?
Excellent. Thank you, everyone, for joining. It was a pleasure doing this session with you, Jim, and we're looking forward to more interaction with everybody that was on the call.
Thanks for joining, everybody.
Back to you, Raquel.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jim and Guido, for being with us today and sharing your knowledge with us. We truly appreciate it. Before we close, I wanted to remind the audience to check out the resource section to access a link to the Purple Knight Security Assessment tool that Guido and Jim discussed today. This concludes today's webcast, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's event, which was sponsored by Semperis and presented by RopenMic.com. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.